In fact, well, the British columnist Katie Hopkins is now live with us from London for the latest on what she has been reporting. And Katie, thanks so much for talking to us. Tell us more about the plans that are being put in place to try and disrupt the event of the Prime Minister.
So what is going to happen on the 22nd for the Howdy Modi event is an NGO, a non-governmental organization, which is basically can be funded by anybody, is sending buses out to all of the mosques in Houston, 12 mosques. It is coordinated on a timetable. Those buses are completely free. The mosques are encouraging people who attend those mosques to turn up, and they will be bussed in to the area for the Howdy Modi event, and they will be therefore encouraged to protest. So I think two things are obvious. One is that this is a funded operation against India by virtue of it being against Modi. And number two, Americans are starting to wake up to the fact that mosques are not like British churches or American churches. They are not quiet, respectful places. They are places of coordination, mobilization and control. So that's a sort of summary of where we're at.
Right, and it certainly is, of course, quite unfortunate that these protests are taking place, and that too by using religious places as points of mobilization, like you very rightly said yourself.
Many things that are upsetting about these protests, and I think what's really important for all of us is to remember that it's not the protests that matter. What matters is that the Prime Minister of India commands an enormous crowd, not only in London when he came to fill the O2, but can fill a crowd in Texas, and that place will have so many people in it. So that's the really key headline that we mustn't move away from. But if we do allow ourselves to talk of these protesters, number one, they're not acting as individuals. They're not sat in their homes thinking, well, I disagree with this, I'll go and protest. They're being encouraged to protest. They're being facilitated to protest. They're being it's almost as if it's seen as the right thing to do. The imam will be encouraging them to come out against India, effectively, because he's representing you. So I think that's unfortunate. And I also think it's really a shame that, what it does for us as Brits and for Americans too is we want to be accepting. We want to believe that migration is a good thing and diversity is a good thing. But we're already suspicious because of terror attacks, because of the Islamist narrative. We're not that far from 9/11 right now in the calendar. And so mosques become places of suspicion. And I think that is a very unfortunate thing for peaceful Muslims who do want to use them as places of worship. Then why allow people to politicize them and use them for an uprising against a country that wants to make you welcome?
Right, and then who do you really think is funding these protests, Katie? As you're saying that these are planned protests, they're not something that are just happening.
I think it's one of these questions we have to ask, who is behind the funding of these things? Because to a regular person who might be thinking of going to the protest, for example, to them that bus is free. It's just a facility that's been provided. But when you look at the level of coordination of this, of an entire network of buses across an entire network of mosques, you know that there is a lot of money involved in that kind of coordination. And you wonder who it is that would be paying paying a lot of money out in order to try and push the Pakistani narrative in America. And I guess it's typical of the globalists who want to destabilize nations and proud nations. And to me, Modi represents a very proud and growing India. And that seems to be what they want to erode away. So I imagine, these funding sources are the same as we see funding sources for ferry boats from Africa to Italy to invade our countries, the same funding that we see of the caravan of individuals coming up from South America into America. It's got that same feeling about it of being a sophisticated, well-funded operation to try and keep down, to try and suppress the positivity and enthusiasm that there is for Modi, and be under no illusion. In America, in Europe, Modi and his name is really starting to become synonymous with with pride in national identity. And I think that's what they hate. That's why he's their target, because they know he's winning.
Right. And then, to what extent then do you think that the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan should be held accountable for these protests that are being organized?
Yeah, I mean, there's blame at many levels, I think. Having just returned from the United Nations Human Rights Council myself yesterday, I certainly think that supranational organizations are responsible. I think the fact the commissioner there decided to kind of side with Pakistan. She said, I especially look to India to take action. And what that translates as is, I'm siding with Pakistan. Hence, you had Imran Khan coming out saying, oh, all of the 58 members agreed with me. He even made up 11 member states just because he felt so sure of himself. And what that does, that sort of culture of enabling, of siding with Pakistan, means the Pakistani mobs in the UK that attack your embassy, and now many Indian citizens also feel a sense of being a target. It kind of empowers them. We have a Pakistani Muslim mayor. These people feel empowered right now. And that's why it's so important that we stand together and recognize that it is absolutely correct, the changes that Modi is making, especially from a female's perspective. I love what he's doing in Kashmir, but, revoking Article 370. I think it's fantastic. And it's very, very strange how the media do not want to highlight the positives in terms of the changes Modi is making. He really is... He really has a battle on his hand, but he seems to be quite the man to fight it.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, what would you say that Pakistan is solely behind these protests and are trying to fuel the disruptive activities during this big event that has been planned, in the run-up to the UNGA at the Howdy Modi Event in Houston?
I would absolutely say Pakistan and elements and powerful elements within Pakistan and their ability to mobilize are funding protests in the USA in order to try and suppress the enthusiasm for India and for Modi. I also believe that same network, in whatever articulation of it, is funding protests in the UK against the Indian embassy because they like how that looks. They like the idea that Pakistan is more powerful than India. But I believe them to be wrong. And many of your viewers and listeners, I'm sure, will have seen a delightful Indian group, representatives of India and different individuals coming out to clean the embassy in London as well. And I think that's what sets you apart. It's what sets India apart, is you are taking the high ground. And that's what Modi does so beautifully. So I believe this is a coordinated and financed effort from Pakistan to try to disrupt the narrative that Modi's doing great things.
Right, but then, Katie, do you really feel that, these protests will really sort of disrupt the enthusiasm on the ground for Prime Minister Modi's visit?
I think they will. What they'll do is two things. One thing is they will reinforce the hate within their own community. So for the Muslim community or the Islamist community in Houston, they will spend the day on the buses, they will go and protest, and they will reinforce each other's hate. And if they didn't hate that much before, by the end of the day, they'll hate more, and they'll all be glad that they hated together. So that will happen. But the second thing I think that will happen is that, people will see that the protests are relatively tiny, relatively insignificant, and that this kind of tidal wave of enthusiasm for these big world leaders who are really setting the world on fire will actually win over. But certainly the hatred that we see, that's what these guys are reinforcing within themselves. And I think it's very harmful for society as a whole. I think it's very harmful for wider America, because Americans will not enjoy seeing mosques being used in this manner to mobilize people against them.